You know, if you study philosophy in Sydney Uni today, they start with Kant. Very few people start with the classics and work their way up. So the value you're getting for money is unbelievable. Let's go to Hegel. Hegel's the most difficult bloke to read I think I've ever tried to read. Oh, except for the postmoderns, who are unreadable. For fun, next week when we're doing postmodern, I might bring you some text just to drive you crazy. You wonder why a postmodern philosopher would write a book. I'll give you that next week. So Hegel came up with this system that says every movement in the world, which he called a thesis, has within it its own destruction, which leads to an antithesis. And eventually that resolves into a synthesis, which becomes the next thesis, which has in itself the seed of its own destruction. Interestingly, so for him, the world is in a state of flux. And guess where he says Western philosophy really should have begun? Heraclitus. So everything's in a state of flux. And he said, when you know that, you're thinking the mind of God. Not that he was particularly religious, but that's what he said. So if I don't know if any of you have read theology, but there was a whole bunch of books for a long time about God as becoming, it's the becoming of God. That's all Hegel. It comes out of Hegel. It's kind of brilliant. Marx later on liked this. You know, in social conflict, that sort of helped him explain what he was doing. But incredibly hard to read. One of the best things about studying philosophy is when you stop reading Hegel. Oh dear. Schopenhauer's too boring. Yeah. Let's move to existentialism. Existentialism will ring more bells with you than any of these, because it's still with us. Existentialism says the starting point of philosophy is the individual experience. This is brand new language in the history of philosophy. And a word that started to be used, which had never really been used before, which was authenticity. Authenticity became the way to live a life. Aristotle had a different term. He meant something slightly different. Aristotle said, if you know the good but don't do it, you're incontinent. Now, that word incontinence means something else to us these days. You get undies with the condom. But that's Aristotle's word, that's incontinent. So in Aristotle's continence is not unlike the authenticity of existentialists. So to live an authentic life is the ultimate for an existentialist. And suddenly, with existentialism, that quality most admired in a person is the power of creativity. And that was brand new. So to find your creative self and be authentic to that suddenly became the highest good. Now, you know, we forget that before then, artists and musicians were thought of much more as mechanics. You know, these days, they're bloody heroes. You know, if you can produce a song and we've got the certain whatever, you know, you're a star and we're in awe of you. But that's quite a modern thing. That's existentialism living out. You know, when Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, he was being ordered around like he was a bloody mechanic. You know, nobody held him in awe because he was an artist, particularly. You know, he was doing a job, being paid for it. So suddenly now, authenticity is the go. Soren Kierkegaard is really the first to kick it off. Kierkegaard is a deeply religious fellow. Humble little sausage, never went more than 10 k's from his hometown in all of his life. He reacted to the church of his day, which was Calvinistic. Do you know what that's about? Calvinism is a brand of theology that majors on the sovereignty of God, and so the human free will and free choice is kind of explained away. So you're saved because God chooses you, and that's the end of it. And if you get chosen, you can't unchoose yourself, you're in. And if you're not chosen, you can't get yourself chosen, stiff sheep. You're destined to the fire, So it's a very bleak kind of theology. But you would think that those who were in would be the happiest people in the world because they can't get unchosen. But in fact, they're famous for being the most miserable people. Sorry?
If you want to
well, you mostly knew by looking down on people who just said word. That theology still lives in, especially Presbyterianism, so it's still around. But in Kierkegaard's day, it was absolutely bleak. Kierkegaard said, life is not a mystery to be solved. Life is a life to be lived. So you can see him moving away from these characters. It doesn't matter that you can't solve all the questions and come to some kind of rational understanding and explain it all. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you live a life that is authentic. So it's still very, very, in itself. But Kierkegaard's one of my favourites. I like him. He's the guy who came up with the phrase that you need to take a leap of faith. You need to leap. If you're going to leap, you've got to leap out something. So he's pretty cool. Sartre, you might have heard of him. He's reasonably modern. He's very gloomy because there's no God anywhere. For Sartre, free will, he calls it the nausea of choice. He says he's very concerned with death, and he says death looms for us, and because of that, we have no excuse. We're on our own. You need to make choices, and it's painful, and it's sickening, but you best make the best of it. And he's still talking about authenticity, and he's still saying the only way to make any kind of sense of this is from individual experience. But you need to kind of be brave as the ship goes down. So it's kind of depressing. A lot of existentialists commit suicide. Nietzsche. He's a character, I like him. He's the guy who pronounced God as dead, so he's kind of famous for that. But he's really a pretty cool character in lots of ways. For him, that wasn't a depressing thought at all. He was saying to people, take responsibility for your life. Stop blaming God for your state, and take responsibility for your life. That's what he meant by God is dead. And probably there's a fair argument to say that what he meant when he said God is dead is he meant metaphysics is dead. So, and that's, the philosophy of everything, all of that's gone. So take responsibility for your life. A really cool character.
Is he the one who said it doesn't kill you, it makes you strong?
Yeah, he did say that. He was a very, very clever writer until they carted him away with syphilis. was one of the first philosophers who was okay at terrorist techniques. Like he would write it, he would address a subject, but he'd just kind of lay a bomb in the room and leave. And he didn't try to make sense of it. He would just lampoon something and get out. And he wrote like that. Lots of people followed him, but that had never happened before him. But incredibly compelling writer. He's still quite fun to read. So I quite like him. He's a guy too, incredibly influential. He's German. He hated Christianity because he said they teach a way of Jesus, but they don't teach you how to be Jesus. And he said he hated Christian compassion, or he used the word pity, because he said there's judgment behind it. And he said that what the world needed was an Übermensch, an overman, a Superman. And he said when you get a Superman, normal morals don't apply to that Superman. You just have to let them be Superman. So Hitler kind of liked it. It suited him very well. And he's very, very influential. Okay. How we going? Not too bad. Political philosophers. Look, Hobbes. Interesting. He lived at the time of the English Civil War. That determined a lot of what he said. Had to be careful about what he wrote. He wrote a book called Leviathan. It's like a telephone book. And he wrote in a way where he had to hide what he really meant. So only the very upper intellectuals could get through this bloody book, let alone see what he's actually saying. And that style of writing is called esoteric. I hear that word used in lots of different ways, but what the word means is that you have to hide something in amongst something else. So he had to write esoterically. And Leviathan is this massive, massive great tome that talks about the need for the liberty, the power of kings and so on. Locke I already mentioned. Rousseau, he's kind of off with the fairies, but still influential. Marx, you know. I don't think we need to say much about Marx, do we? Karl Marx is one of the most prominent political philosophers. And Engels was his right-hand man. He called him the general. And he did all the hard work, I think. Bentham is a Hom, but very, very influential in America. He's a utilitarian. Do you know what that means? Utilitarian is a philosophy that says the maximum is good for the maximum number. So that's an interesting philosophy. Shall we move on to pragmatism? Pragmatism is a philosophy that says you extract theory from practice. Am I boring you to death? It feels like I might be.
Makes new generalizations better.
Yeah, well, actually, that's the problem. Pragmatism is American, super influential in our day. And it says you extract theory from practice. Peirce was a scientist, actually, a mathematician, and only sort of became philosopher at the end of his time. And let me see what I wrote about him. Basically it's this, that you know something's good when you measure the outcome. That's what it's about. How do you know something's good when you measure the outcome? And so, the practice determines the theory. It's distinctly Dewey and Rorty are both highly influential still in the philosophy of education. Yeah.
So there's not an when you say pure open program, there's not an instance of selfishness there, then it's about just measurability.
Yes, that's true. In fact, it's one of the few philosophies that moves away a bit from this kind of self thing. In fact, these guys are particularly critical of those guys because they say you can't test the truth of something just in yourself. You have to make measurements and compare. And that's these characters. So, look, I think we're probably all pragmatists in our day, to a point. And I would challenge you by saying I think you can't set your foundations by pragmatism. Because with pragmatism, you never know in advance if your action's going to be good. So you have to find a way of setting your foundations, not by pragmatism, but having set the foundations, you better be pragmatic. Because it's fairly hard to make an argument in favour of failure. Does that make sense? So anybody who gets anything funded from anybody anymore, from the government or private sector or whatever, it's all about measuring outcomes in order to prove, the value of what you do. Okay. Analytical philosophy. Yeah. Actually, isn't this funny? I was looking at this on the way in. Did you notice the other day I asked a question about final chord. Do you remember that? And somebody was over here and I said, why have men got nipples? And I was asking a final question and the answer came as a material question because in the word there, I didn't wake up to that till after I was driving away. Okay. So analytical philosophy is about finding clarity via formal logic and analysis of language. And was the predominant kind of approach that you'd find in most universities. Except these days with a healthy dose or not healthy dose of postmodernism, which is coming next week. Now, Bertrand Russell's still extremely readable and fun. He loves to poke fun at people and it's fun to read. Wittgenstein is an incredibly influential person. He came from probably one of the richest families in Europe and gave away his wealth to be a philosopher. Incredible. He had 2 or 3 brothers who committed suicide. He had one brother who found... No, he only gave away his part. He had one brother who had an arm blown off in the First World War, and he became a world-class concert pianist with one arm. It's an incredible story. So Wittgenstein, you need to know there's early Wittgenstein and late Wittgenstein. Early Wittgenstein is, both times he's writing about language. And in the early part of his career, language is a mechanical, get it right, it's about grammar, it's about rules. And late Wittgenstein is completely the other way. So late Wittgenstein says meaning is use. That's the key phrase. Meaning is use. He says language gives you no access to reality, but the only thing you can measure are statements. So statements can be judged as true or false. So statements is all there is. So philosophy is now narrowed down to what can be said. It's actually a very interesting branch of philosophy. It's a bit out of favour now, but I think it's pretty cool. So it's all about what can be said. Now, Wittgenstein said languages are games, and You just have to learn the rule of the game, and then you're in a language game, and it's a social phenomenon. So he allowed no reference point out to certainty. He said fundamentalists who have a Bible nearby, he said they're like somebody who goes past and sees a newspaper that says the country's at war. And they think that can't be true. They pick up the top newspaper, put it aside, get the next one. And this one says we're at war too. So he puts that aside and picks up the third one. He said, well, you know, we must be at war. Wittgenstein's a tiny little book called Philosophical Investigations. I spent a whole term with that one book. And when they gave it to me, I thought, yes, a free ride. It turned out to be the hardest blooming term ever. It's a tough book to read, but it's a very challenging and interesting book to read. Wittgenstein revolutionised, I would say, the philosophy of language. And I think most people now believe that the meaning of words is their use. So it's still a discussion, you know, around Wayside, you hear the word fuck every second minute. I sometimes am with Wittgenstein saying, well, that's the language, yeah? And you have to know that. There are other times when I really lament that nobody knows that that's offensive.
And it's realising it's actually a form of violence.
Linguistic violence. Yeah. So, you know, one of my grandchildren I had on a swing and I was giving her a push and she said, Papa, can I tell you a secret? And I always get in trouble when I say yes to secrets, but anyway, she said bum. The rudest word she could think of. So I said, oh, all right. I said, see that lady over there? She's got a big bum. And we found a way of getting bum into every sentence we said for the rest of the day. So this was all day. And when I'm driving her home, she's only 4. She said, we won't tell Mum. And I said, okay, darling, it's a secret, all right, just between you and me. What we said at the swings is just between you and me. Okay. So we finally get home. And she gets out of the car, goes through the front door, she goes straight to her mother, and she said, Papa said bum. I was double-crossed. And the mother's looking at me like, what kind of grandfather are you? So it's this whole kind of question of what's a naughty word, you know. I think most of the wisdom of our day says doesn't matter. But I suspect we've lost the creative power of language. We've forgotten the incredible power in words to create. However, Wittgenstein's winning our day.
It is always a motivation for the intent behind the word that actually the same word can have vastly different impact.
Wittgenstein would say that's the game, depending
yeah.
on what game you're in. But I think it's kind of interesting to think about actual words. And, you know, there was a woman who came here once, a few years ago, had 2 little kids. This is a serious story. And the children thought their name was Scrag and Shitbag. Now, is that just the language game of that family? Or is damage being done?
The thing that worries me about language is, for example, your granddaughter was thinking critically about her use of language, even at that age.
Yeah.
But someone who says the F word without even thinking about it, that's what worries me, is that you know, I work in an environment where it's, you know, offensive to call someone a girl. And they don't think about that at all. And that's what worries me, is because it's so accepted.
Yep. Yep. Look, here you'll hear the F word as a noun, an adjective, an adverb. We've got it all covered.
And it wouldn't offend me, but it would upset me that people aren't thinking critically about this.
Yeah. Yep. Look,
Conversely, if we make harsh judgments.
yes, I know. Absolutely. This isn't absolutes. You know, we're in a funny grey area here, and I think the wisdom of our day is with Wittgenstein that this is all just doesn't matter what the game is, just understand the game and play that game. And I have some reservation about that, but it's not super strong. It's just I have a reservation about it. Yeah.
I just wonder where the wisdom of the narrative got lost. I mean, I'm just a bit disturbed. I mean, I'm not a master, I haven't studied very well, but Marx at least talk about the narrative of classes and stuff, and their conflict and stuff. That like, it's unbelievably upsetting to all of this philosophy. It's not about particular people. I mean, just no philosophy of history, no philosophy of struggle of Indigenous people against colonialism, any of the stuff, no philosophy of groups of people, of competing groups of people. So it just completely lost, like history. I mean, there's history informed for all of this, you know, as you copiously and quite loosely found stuff. I was just wondering whether the history of
because what you're saying,
narrative,
but what you're saying is late philosophy, so it's next week.
But I don't know. I mean, poets must have been seen as philosophers. You know, but this is Sappho, for example, who is a philosopher and just known as a philosopher through poetry. So that there must have been philosopher poets whom you read.
Of course, and all the way through this history, nothing's clear. You know, everything's messy. Everything. We're just talking about what's dominated.
No, what's dominated. Yeah.
Since the war, and since we're going into postmodernism, that's when you get all this movement about what voices are being suppressed and how has history been created by those in power, and so therefore we're being snowed. And how do we deconstruct that? That's all we're doing.
Do you think these shifts in philosophical thought at this time contributed to the reasons for the Great War?
Yes, I think it does. I think philosophy doesn't necessarily lead the way. I think art leads the way, and I think philosophy follows, and I think theology follows philosophy. But I also think you have to understand that this all happens in a massive social change as well. So we could go through this whole thing just from the point of view of technological development, and that all has a massive effect. Once we have a printing press, and once women start writing novels,